Raven Steel didn't just fly planes, she was a warrior of the skies, a free spirit whose steel wings seemed forged from fire and wind the moment she let out her first cry into the world. As a scrawny kid racing along the chain-link fence of her local airport, her bright brown eyes locked on the giant iron birds roaring into the heavens. Folks whispered she didn't just fly, she became the sky. A realm where clouds bowed low and the wind growled in surrender to her unbreakable will. Over 15,000 hours in the air. Journeys slicing across 5 continents. And a spirit tempered by countless trials turned those whispers into undeniable truth. But in the cold, ruthless world of aviation, an industry that eyed someone like her, a black woman with dreams of touching the stars, with suspicion and scorn, those wings weren't just her pride. They were her curse. On a frigid December morning at Horizon Wings headquarters in Chicago, Raven's free wings took a brutal hit. 7 simple words spat from the cracked lips of a gray-suited nobody. Cut through the air like a blade, Captain Steele, we need you to wait out there. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a silent declaration of war, a strike meant to chain her to the ground. Trap her behind invisible walls of bias and power. Raven never imagined those icy words would spark the ember smoldering in the shadows before erupting into a blaze that would torch one of America's oldest aviation empires. Horizon Wings didn't crash from thousands of feet with a shattered engine scream. It buried itself under the weight of corruption, injustice, and dark secrets rotting from within. But in that moment, standing in the icy hallway of the headquarters, her breath mingling with the damp fog, Raven felt only a faint tremor, like war drums echoing from afar, signaling a fight she couldn't yet see but knew would change everything. That morning, Chicago's sky was swallowed by thick fog, a milky shroud blotting out the world. Raven strode through the sprawling terminal complex of O'Hare International, her polished pilot boots clicking steadily against the cold marble floor. 37, she carried a quiet confidence. Not loud or flashy, but forged in brutal flight hours, sleepless nights on military transports in Afghanistan, and landings in conditions that made even grizzled vets tremble. Her uniform was crisp, for gold stripes gleaming on each sleeve like battle scars under the fluorescent lights. Tracing her climb from a broke girl on Baltimore's outskirts to a senior captain at one of America's most prestigious airlines. Her black hair was pulled into a tight, low bun, and her sharp eyes scanned the chaotic terminal, rushing passengers, baggage handlers hauling carts, and the endless drone of gate announcements humming like a restless hymn. She tugged her compact pilot's suitcase behind her, its wheels gliding smoothly, but inside, a vague unease was growing. Raven glanced at her wristwatch, an old military piece her dad had given her before she joined the Air Force. 5:17 a.m. The briefing for Flight HW-27 to San Francisco was set for 5:30, enough time to hit the crew lounge for a black coffee, her sacred ritual before every takeoff. That coffee wasn't just a drink, it was a lifeline. A way to steady the simmering tension and sharpen her mind to a razor's edge before stepping into the cockpit. But today, something felt off. The air around her buzzed with a strange frequency. Like the sky itself was whispering a warning she couldn't quite hear. After months of applications, interviews, and tests so grueling they bordered on absurd, today marked Raven's first day as a senior captain at Horizon Wings. It wasn't just a job, it was a milestone. A middle finger to every barrier society, the industry, and even she herself had once thrown in her path. Horizon Wings was a big name, a century-old titan. Once the poster child of the American dream of flight. But behind the shine, Raven knew the truth. It was a fortress of old-school thinking, run by a mostly white male brass where dusty values dug in like ancient roots, and someone like her, a black woman with relentless ambition, got the side-eye from day one. The crew lounge door swung open as Raven approached, spilling out warm air and the rich scent of fresh coffee mixed with the low buzz of early morning chatter. Inside, the cramped but cozy space held scattered round tables and worn leather chairs. Pilots and flight attendants clustered around, some reviewing flight plans on iPads, others scrolling phones to kill time before their shifts. Raven headed for the coffee station, setting her suitcase down with a soft thud, and instantly felt the air shift. Conversations paused for a split second. Curious glances flicked her way, then darted off, like she was some rare anomaly stepping into a world not built for her. She was used to it, the unspoken attention, the subtle contempt that hit her every time she walked into rooms like this. Latest stats said less than 1% of commercial pilots were black women. Raven wasn't just an exception. She was a crack in the concrete wall of tradition. A living reminder that the sky wasn't the private playground of smug white guys with firm handshakes anymore. She poured coffee into a cup, the black liquid streaming like a midnight river, and stirred in a splash of cream, catching her reflection in the coffee machine's shiny surface. She saw a woman with steady eyes, a face that didn't bend, and a Steele while hiding behind a calm exterior. "Must be Captain Steele," a deep voice rumbled behind her, snapping her thoughts. Raven turned to face a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair cropped tight, for gold stripes matching hers. He stood ramrod straight, broad-shouldered, with the vibe of someone who gave orders, not took them. "Captain Victor Grayson," he said, extending a hand with a stiff shake. "Welcome to Horizon Wings." "Thanks, sir," Raven replied, gripping his hand firmly enough to signal confidence without pushing it. "It's an honor to join the team." "Call me Victor," he corrected, flashing a thin smile that didn't reach his icy eyes. "I'll be your check captain for the next few weeks. I assume you've reviewed today's route." "Yes, Victor," Raven said, keeping her tone even and professional, though she caught the faint shift in his gaze, a sizing up like he was weighing every word. "I've studied Horizon's SFO approach and checked the weather. Some turbulence over the Rockies, but nothing unusual this time of year." Victor nodded, his face a blank slate, but Raven sensed tension in that nod, like he was holding something back. "Good. Crew's waiting in briefing room C. I'll see you there in 5. He turned and walked off, his steps slow but commanding, leaving Raven with a knot forming in her gut. She'd learned to read people fast, a survival skill when hundreds of lives rode on cockpit teamwork. And something about Victor's vibe set off her alarm bells. He wasn't the first to mask doubt with a polite grin, but he felt sharper, like a guy who'd stab you in the back if you gave him an opening. Raven took a deep breath, topped off her coffee, and stirred it like a ritual to steady herself. Her dad's words echoed in her head, a tune that never faded. "You gotta be twice as good to get half as far." It wasn't just advice, it was her life's compass. He'd said it the day she graduated high school, when she swore she'd become a pilot despite skeptical looks from family, friends, and her own neighborhood. Raven had lived those words. Top of her class at the Air Force Academy. 8 years flying military transports with 3 tours in Afghanistan, dodging fire-streaked skies and landing on makeshift strips amid gunfire. Then commercial aviation. Clawing her way up with calloused hands and a heart that never stopped beating for the sky. But Horizon Wings wasn't like the war zones she'd faced. Here, the enemy didn't come with bombs or storms. It lurked in fake smiles, veiled jabs, and a system rigged to spit out anyone like her. As she gripped her coffee, its warmth seeping into her palms, a fire flared in her chest. She hadn't come here to fail. She'd come to fight, to prove the sky had no limits, not for her, not for anyone who dared to dream. As she left the lounge, heading for briefing room C, the airport PA crackled again, announcing a fog delay. Raven smirked, a grin no one saw. Fog could cloak the sky, but it couldn't stop her from flying. And the ones trying to hold her back, Victor Grayson, Horizon Wings, whoever else, would soon learn her wings didn't break easily. They were steel, and they'd cut through any chains to reach freedom. Raven Steele stepped into briefing room C, and the air thickened like an unseen tide churning beneath the calm surface. Harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on 6 flight attendants seated around a long table, their hands flipping through flight packets with dry rustles. Their whispers, bits of gossip about weather, cranky passengers, or late-night hauls hummed like a disjointed soundtrack, but when Raven appeared in the doorway, every sound froze for a heartbeat. Eyes darted her way, some curious, some guarded, all asking the same silent question. Who is she, and what's she doing here? Raven knew that look. The wordless stare. The way her presence rattled the unspoken order of spaces not made for her. It didn't faze her. Shoulders squared, step steady, she walked in. The 4 gold stripes on her sleeves glinting like a declaration she didn't need to voice. Her co-pilot, First Officer Ethan Parker, stood from a chair near the table's end. A young Asian-American guy, about 30, with short black hair and eyes blazing with a rare spark in this high-stakes grind. His face lit up with a genuine grin, a warm ray cutting through the room's chill. Captain Steele, he said, voice bright and alive. Heard great things about you. Looking forward to flying with you. Ethan's smile wasn't just a hello. It was a hand extended in a sea of strangers, and Raven felt its sincerity, a rare thing she valued. Thanks, First Officer Parker, Raven replied, offering a slight smile. Not too friendly to blur the professional line, but enough to match his kindness. Same here. She set her suitcase down, ready to take the empty seat near the table's head, when the door banged open with a sharp clack, slicing through the air like a gunshot. Garrett Holt, Horizon Wing's chief operating officer, strode in, Victor Grayson trailing behind. Garrett was a tall, wiry man, his face etched with deep lines like decades of stress had carved them there. His gray suit clung to his lean frame, but his gait oozed arrogance, each step screaming he owned this room. Victor followed, his cold eyes sweeping over Raven like a hawk sizing up prey, though his expression stayed unreadable. Their entrance turned the air heavy, like a storm cloud rolling in, snuffing out the last scraps of light. Garrett stopped at the table's head, not bothering to sit. He cleared his throat, a gravelly rasp like stones grinding together. Plans changed, he announced, voice stiff like he was reading a script. He avoided Raven's gaze, looking past her like she was a ghost. Captain Grayson's taking HW-27 today. Captain Steele, we need you to wait out there while we sort this out. The room went dead silent, a weight so thick Raven could hear her own breath. Every eye swung to her, the attendants, Ethan, even Victor, like she'd just stepped into the spotlight of a play where no one dared speak the next line. Heat surged up her neck, burning like a slow fuse, but Raven kept her face stone cold, her sharp eyes locked on Garrett. She took a slow breath, voice steady but laced with steel. May I ask why? I've been scheduled for this flight for weeks. Garrett flicked a quick glance at Victor, a split-second tell that screamed coordination. It's about experience, he said, voice hard as iron. San Francisco's a tricky run, and with your unfamiliarity with our procedures, he let it hang like the reason was too obvious to spell out. Raven felt blood pound in her skull, her nails digging into her palms beneath thin leather gloves. She wanted to yell, to force him to look her in the eye and admit this wasn't about experience, it was about her, her skin, her place in a world they didn't want her in. But she swallowed it, forcing calm. With all due respect, she cut in, voice sharper now, slicing the air. I've flown into SFO 73 times in the last decade, including in brutal weather. My qualifications were vetted to death during hiring. Garrett finally met her gaze, his eyes narrowing, a cold glint flashing in them. Captain Steele, he said, voice harder, a warning shot, this isn't up for debate. Please wait out there for a bit. It wasn't a request, it was an order. And the smug edge in his tone hit her like a slap. The air turned suffocating, like all the oxygen got sucked out in that instant. Raven caught Ethan's look from across the table, sympathy mixed with helplessness, but she didn't glance back. She stood still, fists clenched, running through her options. She could argue, demand a real answer, but it'd change nothing. This wasn't the time to swing, not yet, not here, in front of folks who'd just bowed to Garrett's clout. With every shred of dignity she had left, she gave a curt nod, set her flight packet down with a soft thud, and walked out. The hallway outside felt colder than she remembered, the damp fog seeping through her thick uniform, clinging to her skin like a taunt that she didn't belong. Raven leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her breath puffing white in the chill. Her mind spun, thoughts crashing like wreckage from a downed plane. 20 years in, she'd faced every flavor of bias, from passengers demanding a new pilot when they saw her to coworkers muttering about diversity hires behind her back. But this was different. Not some random slight or personal grudge. This was calculated, systemic, a signal she was an outsider they'd do anything to shove out. 10 minutes dragged like a lifetime, each second a nick at her pride. The door finally creaked open, but it wasn't Garrett or Victor, it was Ethan Parker. He looked uneasy, his eyes full of apology as he stepped closer. Sorry about that, Captain, he said low, just for her ears. To me, that was bullshit. Raven turned, pinning him with her gaze. What did they say after I left? She asked, voice low but cutting. Ethan hesitated, glancing down the hall to check for listeners. Said it's standard for new captains, he replied, quieter now. But, he paused, then pushed on with a flicker of doubt. I've been here 3 years. Seen 4 new captains start. None got pulled from their first flight. A familiar weight sank into Raven's chest, like a stone pressing down. She nodded slowly, eyes narrowing as she processed it. Thanks for telling me, she said, voice even but tinged with gratitude. There's more, Ethan added, leaning closer, his voice a near whisper. I'm assigned as Grayson's co-pilot. But they want you shadowing HW 422 to Seattle. Short hop, they say, to get you up to speed on company flow. He air-quoted it, a wry smirk tugging his lips. Raven's brow furrowed, suspicion flaring. Who's the captain? Henry Caldwell. The name hit like a punch. Hard. Sudden, nearly cracking her calm mask. Henry Caldwell, Horizon's most senior captain, a guy notorious not just for his chops but for his loud rants against diversifying the pilot ranks. Raven had never met him, but his rep rang out like a warning bell. A brick wall of the old guard, unforgiving to anyone daring to shake things up. Got it, she said softly, voice steady, but inside a storm was brewing. Captain, Ethan corrected himself, his tone turning serious. If you want to file a complaint, I'll back you. This ain't right. Raven studied him, weighing his offer. A complaint on day 1 would brand her a troublemaker no matter how legit. She'd spend her career navigating these shark-infested waters, knowing when to speak and when to bide her time. I'll handle HW 422 first, she decided, voice low but firm. But I appreciate it, Ethan. Not everyone steps up like that. Ethan nodded, his eyes shining with understanding and a hint of respect. Good luck with Caldwell, he said, a dry edge in his tone. He's old school. Raven almost laughed at the understatement, but settled for a faint smirk. I've dealt with old school before, she shot back, a challenge in her voice. As Ethan walked off, his figure fading through the door, a chill raced down her spine. She knew what lay ahead, a fight not just with Henry Caldwell, but with a system dead set on proving she didn't deserve the wings on her shoulders. Flight HW 422 to Seattle wasn't a routine gig for Raven Steele, it was a gladiator pit, a crucible built to melt her resolve. Stepping onto the Boeing 737, her boots rang sharply on the metal floor, and the cockpit air hung heavy with a warning vibe. This wasn't just a quick hop. It was Horizon Wing's silent middle finger, and Raven knew who'd be swinging the sword. Captain Henry Caldwell, a living relic of a bygone era. A guy whose hardline rep howled louder than a jet engine in a storm. Henry Caldwell wasn't just a seasoned pilot. He was a ghost of the old days, a 60-something man with thinning gray hair clinging to his scalp like rusted wire. His face was a roadmap of bitterness. Pale blue eyes glinting with the arrogance of someone who'd weathered decades in the game without bending. When Raven entered the cockpit, he gave her a single glance. A curt nod, no words, like her presence was a smudge on his windshield he had to tolerate. His co-pilot, Lucas Hayes, a twitchy young guy with messy brown hair and nervous eyes, shot Raven a quick look, a flash of guilt before dropping his gaze, caught between two wolves. Raven took the observer seat behind them, hands resting lightly on her knees, her keen eyes scanning every inch of the cockpit. She stayed quiet, but inside, a fire simmered, not blind rage, but a controlled burn honed over 20 years facing guys like Henry. He wasn't the first to sneer at her, and he wouldn't be the last. Today, she wasn't just a pilot. She was a fighter stepping into the ring, and every move Henry made, every word he spat, was a whetstone to sharpen her edge. Henry ran the pre-flight checks like a machine, barking the checklist in a low growl that filled the tight space, each word dripping with the confidence of 1,000 runs. Lucas answered fast, voice shaky like he was scared to piss off the old man. Raven watched, cataloging every step in Horizon's playbook, fuel systems, hydraulics, radio signals. She'd give Henry his due. The guy had skills, but his polish couldn't hide the truth he didn't want her here. Not because she couldn't cut it, but because she was everything he despised. Change, diversity. A future where he wasn't king. As the plane taxied back from the gate, engines snarling awake, Henry finally turned to Raven. He didn't look straight at her. His eyes slid past like she was a speck in his peripheral. I'll walk you through it, Steele, he said, voice deep and dripping with condescension. So you can learn a thing or two. He hit learn with a smirk like he was talking to a toddler, not a captain with flight hours rivaling his own. Raven clenched her jaw, nails biting into her palms, but her face stayed ice cold. She wanted to snap back, remind him she'd flown through storms he'd only dream of, landed in hellholes that'd make him quake. But she held her tongue. This wasn't the moment to blow, it was time to watch, to gather, to turn this humiliation into ammo for a bigger fight she felt brewing. She zeroed in on the controls, on Henry's flap adjustments, on Lucas's NAV checks. Every detail was a puzzle piece, and she'd make them weapons soon enough. The flight went smoothly for most of it. The 737 carved through thick clouds, engines humming steadily like a living beast. Raven sat still, ears tuned to the clipped chatter between Henry and air traffic control. He flew with surgical precision, every move slick like a rehearsed symphony. She hated admitting it. But Henry Caldwell could fly, owned the sky in a way only the old dogs could. But his talent didn't erase the fact he was a dinosaur stuck in yesterday. And Raven's presence was a loud alarm that his time was running out. Trouble hit as they dropped altitude for Seattle. Through the cockpit glass, Raven glimpsed the city's hazy skyline. Green hills peeking under a cloud veil. Henry punched in the radio frequency for approach control, fingers flicking fast over the panel. But Raven caught it, he botched it. The frequency was off from Seattle-Tacoma's standard. A tiny slip that could spark chaos if it wasn't fixed pronto. She glanced at Lucas, waiting for him to call it. But he just hunched lower, fingers gripping his clipboard, too spooked to challenge Henry. Time slowed for a beat. Raven's pulse thumped hard, adrenaline surging like a tidal wave. She could speak up, she had to. A pilot wasn't just a driver. They were a shield for the hundreds of souls in back. But calling out Henry now, in front of Lucas, wouldn't just be a tech fix. It'd be a public gut punch to his ego. And with a guy like him, that wouldn't end quietly. She took a sharp breath, grip tightening on her seat. Captain Caldwell, she said, voice even but cutting, approach frequencies 120.95, not 121. 10. Henry froze, hand hovering midair. He turned slowly, blue eyes boring into her like he wanted to drill through her skull. The cockpit went dead, air so thick it choked. I know what I'm doing. Steel. He snarled, voice low and raspy. Don't need a rookie like you schooling me. Raven held his stare, unflinching. Not schooling you, she shot back, calm but firm. Just making sure we don't get lost. Henry's eyes narrowed, lips thinning to a razor line. Lucas sat statue still, hands trembling on his lap. After a tense eternity, Henry muttered something under his breath and punched in the right frequency, grudgingly. ATC crackled through, confirming contact, and the descent rolled on without a hitch. But that small win didn't thrill Raven. It just drove home the truth. Henry didn't just disrespect her. He was a liability, too proud to own a mistake. When the plane touched down, rolling onto Seattle's tarmac, a chill snaked down Raven's spine. She'd cleared this hurdle, but it was just the start. Henry didn't say another word as they deplaned. But his glare, pure venom and contempt, said it all. He wanted her to quit, to buckle under his weight. Too bad for him, Raven wasn't the buckling type. She'd flown through worse storms than Henry Caldwell, and she'd be damned if he'd dictate her fate. Back in Chicago, Raven got word she'd keep shadowing other captains that week, all guys, all cut from Henry's cloth. A pattern clicked into place like a trap snapping shut. They weren't just testing her. They were trying to choke her out, hoping she'd ditch Horizon before she could plant her feet. Big mistake. Raven didn't come to be crushed. She came to fight, and if it took ripping their web apart with her bare hands, so be it. That night, in her small Chicago suburb apartment, Raven sank into the couch, a glass of red wine in hand, its deep aroma curling around her. Streetlights streamed through the window, painting faint streaks across her face. She fired up a video call with Ivy Brooks, her little sister, a fiery young lawyer with the same unyielding spirit. When Ivy's face popped on screen, she damn near screamed as Raven recounted the day. They did what? Who's this Caldwell clown treating you like that? Raven smirked, sipping her wine. An old fossil stuck in the past, Ivy. But he's not the real problem. I think there's something bigger rotting at Horizon. Ivy's brows knitted, her brown eyes blazing. What do you mean? They hiding something? Not sure yet, Raven said, voice pensive. But Caldwell's slip today wasn't random. If a vet like him sloppy, what about the rest? I need to dig deeper. You can't let them walk over you like this, Ivy snapped, fury crackling in her tone. This isn't just personal, it's systemic. You gotta hit harder, Raven. Raven eyed her sister through the screen, warmth seeping into her chest. Ivy always pushed her forward, even when she wanted to pause and plan. I know, she said, but I need ammo before I shoot. They won't win easily. When the call ended, Raven set her glass down, staring into the dark ahead. Today was a skirmish, but a bigger storm loomed. Henry Caldwell was just the first gust. What waited ahead was fire, steel, a war she couldn't lose. Deep down, she knew. The crucible was lit, and she'd walk through it, even if it meant burning everything to find the truth. Raven Steele never thought the sky, her refuge of freedom and strength, could feel so damn suffocating. 3 weeks into Horizon Wings, she realized her real enemy wasn't the storms or busted engines she'd tackled flying transports through Afghanistan. It was a shadow web, a faceless monster spun from corruption, power, and a cold disregard for human life. It didn't roar like wind or crack like gunfire, it hid in fake grins, icy glances, and locked doors she was never meant to open. But Raven didn't bow to shadows. She'd learned to light them up, step by step, with sharp eyes and a will forged in the hardest days of her life. The days after Henry Caldwell were a relentless grind. Raven got stuck, shadowing more captains. Old white guys with silver hair, cloudy eyes full of swagger, and voices dripping with patronizing crap. Like she was a green intern, not a pilot with over 15,000 hours. They didn't come at her head-on, they didn't have to. Their disdain seeped out in every shrug when she asked a question, every pointless lecture on stuff she'd mastered years ago, every glance like she was a stain they couldn't scrub off. Each flight was a test. Not of her flying chops, because no one dared question the skills of someone who'd landed in hellscapes that made pros sweat, but of her grit, betting she'd crack under their quiet pressure. But Raven didn't come to break. She tracked every detail like a hunter stalking prey, every minor slip in procedure, every sly dig. Every doubtful look, filing them away in a small notebook tucked in her uniform pocket. She logged the weird stuff, a captain skipping a hydraulic check because it took too long, a co-pilot muttering about signing off on planes he knew weren't ready, whispers in the crew lounge that Horizon ain't what it used to be. Each scrap was a thread, and she knew if she kept pulling, they'd lead to a bigger truth lurking in the dark. One freezing morning, with fog still choking O'Hare's runways, Raven was assigned to shadow a Denver flight with Captain Miles Donovan. Miles was mid-40s, brown hair flecked with gray, green eyes carrying a rare quiet vibe among the cocky pilots she'd met. He didn't start off hostile like Henry. Greeted her with a nod and a thin smile, like he wanted distance but not a fight. That made Raven warier. Kindness here usually came with a catch, and she'd learned not to trust easy smiles. The Denver run was mostly silent. The 737 sliced through dense clouds, engines purring steadily like a heartbeat. Raven sat in the jump seat, watching Miles fly with the precision of a guy who'd logged tens of thousands of hours. He didn't preach or strut like Henry, just did his job, trading clipped words with his co-pilot in a low, even tone, occasionally glancing out the windshield to scan the sky. But mid-flight, as the plane leveled off and weak sunlight pierced the clouds, Miles turned to her. With all due respect, he said softly, just for her ears, not everyone's cool with how they're treating you, Steele. Raven looked up, locking eyes with him, hunting for any hint of bullshit. But Miles didn't smirk, his gaze held a flicker of guilt, a touch of realness, though still cautious, like he wasn't ready to dive in deep. But you're not speaking up, she replied. Voice steady but edged, testing his armor. Miles stared out the windshield, hands tightening on the yoke without thinking. It's complicated, he said after a beat, voice dropping like he was spilling a secret he didn't want overheard. Keeping these birds in the air isn't always black and white. There's bigger stuff than us. Steele. Stuff you'll figure out soon enough. His words planted a seed of doubt in Raven's gut. If something was rotten at Horizon, it wasn't just about screwing her over. It could be about safety, about the thousands of lives they hauled daily. She didn't answer right away, just nodded, but inside, a spark flared, a hunch she was teetering on the edge of something darker than she'd guessed. When they landed in Denver, Miles clammed up, but his look, part regret, part powerlessness, left her with a silent question. What does he know that he won't say? The rail break came one gloomy afternoon in Horizon's massive hangar. Outside, gray clouds smothered the sky, weak light filtering through high windows, splashing faint streaks across the oil-stained concrete. Noise bounced everywhere, drills whining, metal clanging, techs laughing, a chaotic symphony. Raven walked through the maintenance bay. Boots tapping steadily, suitcase rolling smoothly behind her. She wasn't here to work, just to watch, to get a beat on how Horizon ran its fleet after Miles's cryptic nudge. She paused by a Boeing 737 under repair, eyeing techs dismantling an engine with craftsmanlike care. The smell of grease and hot metal hung thick, mingling with the cold bite of a winter afternoon. Raven was jotting something in her notebook when a figure caught her peripheral. A guy standing a few yards off, half hidden behind the plane. When she looked up, he gave her a quick nod, a subtle but loaded gesture. Raven froze, eyes locking on him. Jasper Reed, a black tech around 50, built solid like a rock, hands rough and oil-smeared. Calluses thick from decades wrenching on machines. His brown eyes gleamed with wariness, like an old wolf who'd seen too much to trust easily. He wore a dark green jumpsuit, hard hat cocked sideways. And when he nodded again, Raven caught the urgency in it. Wordlessly, she snapped her notebook shut, slipped it into her pocket, and followed him into the shadowed nook behind the 737. The space back there was tight as a steel coffin, dim and stifling, lit only by a flickering yellow bulb swinging from a frayed cord overhead. Shadows clung to every corner, draping the plane's scratched hull in ghostly streaks like it was hiding a deadly secret. The hangar's racket, drills, hammers, distant chatter got muffled by the jet's bulk, creating an eerie bubble of quiet, like they'd crossed into another world, cut off from the fake hustle outside. The air reeked of oil and scorched steel, sticking to every breath like a silent alarm. Jasper stood across from her, barely a yard away, his stocky frame unyielding. His jumpsuit was splotched with grease, his rough hands crossed tightly over his chest, like he was holding a weight he couldn't drop. His dark eyes darted around, over dusty tool racks, the narrow exit to the bay, the gloom where anyone could be lurking. It was the look of a man who'd lived too long on edge, a survivor who knew every move could be a trap. Raven stood still, hands deep in her uniform pockets, fingers brushing her notebook. She didn't budge, didn't speak, just waited, a deliberate silence, like a hunter sizing up her mark. She didn't know Jasper hadn't met him, hadn't heard his name in crew lounge chatter or quick ground team briefs. But something about him screamed he wasn't small time. It wasn't just the grit in his weathered face, deep crow's feet, lips pressed tight like he was bottling rage. It was a quiet strength, a resolve she recognized from her own battles with bias and bullshit. He wasn't just a wrench-turner, he carried a story, a scar. Maybe a mission she couldn't yet peg. Jasper took a deep breath, his exhale fogging white in the cold, then met her eyes, unflinching. "They're faking records," he said flat out, voice low and steady. Each word a knife slashing the thick air, sharp and no nonsense. No hesitation, no dancing around. It was a fact, pent up too long, now bursting free like a smothered flame. Not just tweaking dates, real structural issues, downplayed or ignored. Raven felt her blood turn to ice, a jolt slamming her chest, but her face didn't flinch, eyes locked on Jasper, steady, no panic leaking through. She'd suspected Horizon was dirty, Miles's hints. The little screw-ups she'd logged, but this was a bomb, a truth that could topple an empire if it hit the right hands. She breathed short, voice dropping to a near whisper, but heavy with force. "Why tell me? You don't know me." Jasper didn't answer right off. He tilted his head, eyes raking over her. Not judging, but confirming something he'd already settled on. He uncrossed his arms, a slow, deliberate move, and when he spoke again, his voice dipped lower, trembling with a feeling she couldn't name. "I know who you are, Captain Steele," he said, hitting each word like stones dropped in still water. "Heard him talking about you in the tech break room. A black captain, a woman, someone they've been trying to shove out since day one. Saw you yesterday refusing to fly that 737 with the NAV glitch the ground crew called no big deal. Saw you face down Garrett Holt, not backing off, even when he roared at you like a cornered animal." Raven paused, yesterday flooding back like a cold gust. She remembered Garrett's furious glare, his voice booming in the cockpit when she canceled that flight, a call she knew would paint a target on her, but she couldn't let slide. She'd felt the eyes on her then, co-pilot, ground crew, gate staff, but hadn't clocked Jasper there, watching from a distance, quietly sizing her up. "Been here 25 years, Jasper went on, voice heavy like a confession. "Seen it all, planes rolling out with cracked props, leaking engines, corroded frames. Signed off on M not 'cause I wanted to, but 'cause I had no choice. Got 2 kids, one's 19, in college. One's 16, dreams of flying like you. Lose this job, they've got nothing. But then he stopped, fists clenching, nails digging into his rough palms. Eyes darkening like he was staring into a bad memory. A year ago, my buddy Tyrone wouldn't sign off a plane with an engine fault. They fired him on the spot, no reason, no severance. 2 months later, he hung himself in his garage. I found him with a note saying he couldn't live with the guilt of letting those planes fly before. Raven's spine iced over, her heart twisting at Jasper's story. She didn't know Tyrone, but the raw pain in Jasper's voice, the ache of a man who'd lost a chunk of his soul, hit her hard. It dragged up her own ghosts. Nights in Afghanistan when she lost wingmen to blasts she couldn't stop, memories she buried but never shook. Jasper looked at her, his eyes now a mix of desperation and hope. Can't let that happen again, he said. Been collecting proof, logs, emails, notes for months, stashing M at home, waiting for someone brave enough to use it. When I saw you stand up to Garrett, I knew you were different. You're not scared of him. You can do what I can't, you can tear this web down. Raven stood rooted, breath slowing as she chewed on his words. His logic clicked like a spotlight through fog. He hadn't picked her randomly. He'd watched her, heard about her, seen her move, and in her he saw a shot at redemption. A shield for others against Tyrone's fate. This wasn't their first meeting in his mind, it was the payoff of a quiet vigil he'd kept from afar, waiting for someone worth betting on. They're faking records, Jasper repeated, voice steadier now. A final call to arms. Not just piddly stuff, they're covering flaws that could turn these planes into coffins midair. And I think you're the only one who can stop him. He pulled a small USB from his jumpsuit pocket, its metal glinting under the dim bulb. This is everything I've got, he said. Voice low but vibrating with resolve. Flight logs, maintenance reports, internal memos. I copied M from the tech computers, from emails they thought were trashed, into TechWiz. But I know enough to keep M safe. At least 30% of the fleet's got issues. Cracked props, fuel leaks, corroded frames. Stuff that should have been grounded for real fixes. But they force us to sign off. Threaten to fire anyone who doesn't. Saw M do it to Tyrone, and I don't want to see more people die. Raven stared at the USB in Jasper's hand, feeling it radiate a heat that wasn't there. A power that could incinerate Horizon if she played it right. She reached out, fingers trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what he'd just dumped on her shoulders. Thank you, she said, voice low but solid. I won't let it fall into the wrong hands. Jasper nodded. A faint spark of hope in his eyes. A light he hadn't seen in years. Watch yourself steal, he warned, voice dropping to a final caution. They've got cash, lawyers, pull. If they find out you've got this, they won't just fire you, they'll destroy you like they did Tyrone. Raven gripped the USB tightly, its weight more than metal, it was truth, duty. Pressing into her palm. She nodded again, her eyes meeting Jasper's in a silent pact. I get it, she said. And I won't let Tyrone's death be for nothing. Jasper gave a sad, weathered smile, etched with years of holding it in. Good luck, Captain, he said, then turned, melting into the tech crowd like a ghost fading into the dark. Raven stood alone in the nook, clutching the USB like a live grenade. She just crossed a line with no way back. If Jasper was right, if 30% of Horizon's fleet were flying death traps, she wasn't just facing a company. She was up against a machine that'd crush anyone who dared defy it. But she couldn't turn tail. Not after Jasper's gamble. Not after Tyrone's loss. Not after everything she'd fought for. She tucked the USB into her uniform pocket, close to her heart, and stepped out of the shadows. The hangar's noise crashed back. Drills, bangs, laughter. But it wasn't chaos anymore. It was a war drum, driving her forward. Horizon Wing's dark web was cracking open, and Raven Steel would be the one to shine a light through it. Even if she had to burn herself to do it. That night, back in her apartment, Raven sat at the kitchen table, the dim lamp casting a glow over the USB amid a sprawl of papers. She plugged it into her laptop, the screen flaring with files, faked maintenance logs, internal emails ordering safety skips, notes from text force to greenlight unfit planes. Each line stabbed at her faith in the aviation she loved, but it also fueled her fire to act. She couldn't stop, not now, not after seeing the ugly truth Jasper had handed her. This wasn't just her fight, it was Tyrone's, Jasper's, and every innocent soul who'd die if she sat on her hands. She sipped cold coffee, eyes glued to the screen, and in her gut, a plan took shape, a plan to unravel this shadow web, one thread at a time. 3 weeks at Horizon Wings felt like 3 centuries locked in an invisible cage for Ravensteel. Each day was a silent slugfest. Not with storms or busted engines, but with cold stares, sly digs, and a shadow web showing its lethal fangs. She'd gathered enough to know Horizon wasn't just a bigots club. It was a killing machine dressed up in fake smiles and glossy reports. But tonight, the fuse she'd been rigging was ready to blow. And Raven knew there was no turning back. That evening, she was slated to command a red-eye from Chicago to Las Vegas, a late-night slog no pilot wanted. With odd hours and passengers often loud and sloshed. Ethan Parker, her co-pilot, waited at the gate, his familiar grin cutting through O'Hare's dim lights. "Captain Steele," he said, a playful lilt in his voice, "ready for a long night?" Raven nodded, flashing a faint smile, not from joy, but from valuing Ethan's presence in this shitstorm. "Always ready," she replied, voice low but steady. But inside, a cold hunch was swelling. Her getting this flight wasn't random. If they wanted her to flop, they'd pick a friendly witness like Ethan to rat out her slip-ups. This wasn't just a flight, it was a setup. And Raven was hell-bent on flipping it into her own weapon. Pre-flight checks kicked off in a pressure cooker. Raven and Ethan boarded the 737, the cockpit air icy and thick. Like the jet itself was braced for an explosion. Raven ran through every system with double the care: fuel, hydraulics, radios, each step precise as a surgeon's cut. She wasn't just checking for protocol. She was hunting for the flaw she knew was hiding. A crack Horizon's dark web had glossed over, and she found it. Scrolling the cockpit's maintenance log, Raven spotted a glitch that'd kill you if you missed it. The air intake valve check date didn't match the service record. A detail a rookie might shrug off. But for Raven, who'd flown through war zones where one slip turned a plane into a fireball, it was a screaming red flag. She turned to Ethan, voice low and sharp. "Double-check the intake valve." "Something's off." Ethan nodded, no hesitation, and dove into the system. Raven radioed the ground crew, demanding the hard copy maintenance log. A gruff voice crackled back, annoyed. "It's all cleared, Captain. No issues." "No." Raven shot back, voice like steel. "I want the original log. Bring it up here, now." She didn't care about their grumbling, she cared about the 150 souls boarding soon, and she'd be damned if she'd fly a bomb waiting to blow. 10 minutes later, a ground tech stomped in, shoving a crumpled stack of papers at her. Raven flipped through, eyes racing over lines and numbers. There it was, a handwritten note scratched out, flagging a minor leak in the intake valve from the last check, never fixed. Instead, someone had signed it off with a scrawled, "Not significant." Rage flared in Raven's chest, hot as a brush fire. She spun to Ethan, voice low but trembling with strain. "We're not flying this. Get maintenance up here, now." Ethan's eyes widened for a split second, but he nodded and jumped on it, no questions. Raven stepped out of the cockpit, facing the ground crew milling below. "This plane's not airworthy," she declared, voice ringing like a hammer strike in the hush. "I'm not taking off till that valve's checked and fixed right." Murmurs of irritation rippled through the techs, but before anyone could push back, a tall figure loomed from the gate. Garrett Holt marched up, face flushed with fury, eyes narrowed to slits. "Ground crew cleared this bird," he growled, voice booming like thunder in a clear sky. "What's your basis for overriding?" "A gut feeling." Raven stood tall, unflinching, eyes locked on his. 20 years of experience and FAA regs demanding full, accurate logs before takeoff, she said, cool but cutting. "The valve check date's off and there's a leak noted unfixed. I'm not flying a plane that could blow midair and you shouldn't make me." Garrett's face twisted, lips thinning to a slit. "At Horizon, we value efficiency, Steele," he said, voice dropping to a threat. "Don't hold us up over a nothing detail." "Nothing detail?" Raven snapped, voice rising, fury breaking through. "A flaw that could spark chaos if it's not fixed, that's not nothing, Holt. That's life or death." The air between them crackled, a storm brewing. Garrett glared, eyes blazing hate, but he didn't bite back right away. After a tense beat, he barked at the ground crew to recheck the valve. Raven knew it wasn't over. She just stabbed Garrett's pride, and he wouldn't let it slide easily. The verdict came after 30 nail-biting minutes. The valve was leaking, not critical yet. But for Raven, not critical didn't cut it. Everything had to be perfect or she wouldn't fly. The flight got cancelled, passengers shuffled to another plane, and Garrett stormed off without a word. His glare promising payback she knew wouldn't hit in time. That night, Raven dragged herself home, body wrecked, mind spinning. She spread it all out on the kitchen table, Jasper's files. Her own notes, a copy of today's log. Each piece was a brick in the truth she was building. And now, the wall was tall enough to show the full, ugly picture. Horizon wasn't just cutting corners, they were gambling with lives, punishing anyone who called it out. She cradled a cold coffee, staring at the mess. One question looped in her head. What's next? She could stay quiet, keep digging, hope for a safe out. But then Garrett's sneer, the ground crew's shrugs, that not significant scrawl flashed back. No, silence was complicity. And Raven Steele didn't roll that way. She video-called Ivy. When her sister's bright face lit the screen, Raven spilled it all, the cancelled flight, the log screw-up. Ivy's brown eyes flared with outrage. You can't let him off, she snapped, fierce as hell. This isn't personal anymore, it's a crime. Got enough to nail M yet? Almost, Raven said, thoughtful. Need one more knockout punch. Something they can't dodge. Ivy leaned closer, a sly grin tugging her lips. You need a lawyer? And lucky you, I'm here. We'll draft a report, hit FAA, NTSB, even the press if we have to. You want to go big? Raven grinned, her first real one all day, small but fierce. Big's the only way I play, Ivy. They worked till 3 a.m. Ivy shaping Raven's report with FAA and NTSB regs, weaving in Jasper's proof and her own. When Ivy crashed on the couch, Raven sat alone in the dark, laptop glowing white. She took a deep breath, finger hovering over send. This was the fuse, hit it, and everything burned, making her a target for a system that'd crush her flat. But she didn't waver long. One firm click and it was off to FAA, NTSB, and a Chicago Tribune reporter Ivy knew. Scent flashed up, and Raven leaned back, a weird mix washing over her. Relief, dread, but mostly resolve. The fuse was lit, and whatever came, she'd done right. Outside, fog blanketed Chicago, but in her tiny apartment, a fire blazed, one that'd torch Horizon's shadow web no matter the cost. The next day, Raven strode into Horizon's headquarters, and the vibe had shifted, heavy, choking, like the calm before a monster storm. She wasn't the new captain on the sidelines anymore. She was a threat, a flame roaring from ashes they thought they'd stomped out. Her report from last night, a bomb wrapped in dry facts and ironclad proof, had hit FAA, NTSB, and the Tribune. Now, Horizon's dark web was fracturing, and Raven knew they'd come for her. She wasn't scared, she was ready for the final showdown, even if it was her last stand here. She got hauled into Garrett Holt's office at noon, winter sun struggling through thick fog outside. Stepping past the polished oak door, the room felt like a morgue. Garrett sat behind a massive desk, face carved with furious lines, eyes narrowed like he wanted to gut her. Henry Caldwell flanked him, arms crossed, blue eyes glinting with wolfish hate, ready to pounce. Two Horizon lawyers, slick guys in pricey black suits, faces blank, stood in the corner, clutching thick briefcases like shields. No one offered a seat, and Raven didn't expect it. This wasn't a meeting, it was a trial, and she was the lone defendant. Garrett didn't waste time. He slammed a fist on the desk, the bang ringing like a gunshot. Captain Steele, he snarled, voice shaking with barely leashed rage, we've got word you've accessed restricted areas, pulled info from staff beyond your clearance, and worse, contacted outsiders about internal matters. You've blatantly breached your confidentiality agreement. What you got to say? Raven stood tall, shoulders locked, eyes drilling into Garrett. She felt the room's heat, Garrett's fury, Henry's scorn, the lawyer's cold calculus, but she didn't blink. She'd survived Afghan nights under fire, landed on dirt strips between life and death. This was just another fight, and she held the winning card. She let Garrett vent, let his arrogance spill like poison, before firing back. I sent a report to FAA and NTSB this morning, she said, voice cool but slicing the thick air. It's got faked maintenance logs, proof of planes flying with known faults, and statements from staff pressured to skip safety. The Chicago Tribune got the same package today, plus evidence of retaliation against whistleblowers. She paused, letting each word sink in, bullets punching through their smug armor. I didn't breach a contract. I protected lives. Something Horizons clearly ditched. The room went graveyard quiet. Air sucked dry. Garrett's jaw dropped. No sound coming out. Face red. Hands quaking on the desk. Henry slammed the table again. Leaping up, jabbing a finger at her like a judge passing sentence. You're sabotaging this company, he roared, voice bouncing off the walls. Who do you think you are? Raven met his glare, unyielding. I'm a pilot, she said, voice low but alive with power. I'm the one accountable for hundreds of lives every takeoff. Who are you? Flying planes you know aren't safe. Putting cash over blood and bone. Henry opened his mouth to snap back, but one lawyer raised a hand, shutting him up. The older one, silver hair and ice-cold eyes, stepped forward, voice smooth but laced with menace. Captain Steele, do you grasp the fallout here? Horizon can sue you for defamation, breach of confidentiality, and trust me, we've got the muscle to make sure you never fly again. Raven smirked, fearless, defiant. And do you grasp the fallout of FAA yanking your operating license? She countered, voice frigid. Or families finding out you flew death traps on purpose. I've got two demands. Fire the senior execs now and hire an independent firm to audit all maintenance. Non-negotiable. That'll bankrupt us. Henry bellowed, fists balled tight. Raven arched a brow. Eyes like daggers. Versus FAA shutting Horizon down for good or hundreds of lawsuits from passengers' families. Your call. The room turned into a silent battlefield, every glance a sword. Every word a shot. Garrett stared, hate blazing in his eyes, but a flicker of panic he couldn't mask. The lawyers whispered, fingers flipping through files, hunting for an out. After an hour of shouting matches, Henry's yells, lawyer threats, Raven's icy calm, Garrett caved. He agreed to axe the execs and bring in an outside firm, but his voice dripped with reluctance. His glare vowing revenge that'd never land. Too late. FAA moved faster than anyone guessed. 2 days later, they yanked Horizon's license, calling systemic safety breaches unacceptable in aviation. Probe snowballed, staff interviews, headquarters raids, headlines screaming coast to coast. The Tribune dropped its first bomb, Horizon Wings, aviation empire falls to corruption and neglect. The company filed for bankruptcy a week later, stock tanking, rivals cutting ties. Atlantic Airways swooped in, buying Horizon's assets, keeping most staff except brass like Garrett and Henry. Now facing DOJ criminal charges. Underscore 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 underscore. Raven stood outside Horizon's headquarters on its last day, watching workers peel the logo off the building. Chicago's sky hung gray, but the fog had thinned, weak light hitting her face. She wore a thick coat, hands in pockets, breath fogging white in the cold. Across the street, Ethan Parker walked up. 2 steaming coffees in hand from a nearby joint. He handed her one, a tired but real smile on his lips. It's official, he said, voice mixing exhaustion and thrill. Atlantic's got Horizon's assets and offered spots to all certified staff. Minus the execs under investigation. Just got my email. Raven sipped her coffee, warmth spreading down her throat like a bomb. Good, she said, voice low but satisfied. They deserve a fresh shot, the ones not tangled in this mess. Ethan eyed her, respect shining through. You did what no one dared, Raven. You took M down inside out. Raven gave a faint smile, watching the Horizon logo crash down, metal chunks clanging dryly on the ground. Not me, she said. Jasper, Lena, we all did it. I just hit the button. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, cutting in. She pulled it out, Ivy calling. When she answered, Ivy's voice burst through, hyped and wild. You see the news? DOJ just slapped Garrett and the rest with criminal charges. Reckless endangerment. They're toast. Raven chuckled softly, a rare sound after these brutal months. Ethan just filled me in, she said, a grin creeping in. Thanks, Ivy. Couldn't have done it without you. Don't thank me. Ivy shot back, playful but proud. You torched their world. I just handed you the match. Call done. Raven looked across the street again. The Horizon building stood like a gutted corpse. A once proud empire, now rubble under its own sins. Mixed feelings churned inside, satisfaction at justice, but a hollow ache from the cost. Her Horizon career ended before it started, but no regrets. She'd pick truth over safety, like always. Ethan stood beside her, quiet for a bit, then spoke. What's next for you? Raven turned, a new fire in her eyes. Flying, she said simply. Atlantic offered a gig. I'll start fresh. And this time, on planes that won't kill anyone. Ethan grinned, nodding. I'll fly with you if they let me. Raven nodded back, a rare smile breaking through. As they walked off, Chicago's wind carried a new beginnings tune. Horizon Wings was gone. Not from a sky-high crash, but from the darkness it bred. And Raven Steel, with her steel wings, stood tall in the ashes, ready to soar again. When spring's first rays pierced Chicago's thinning fog, Raven Steel sat in a small cafe near Horizon's old HQ, eyes fixed on the scene outside. Workers in orange vests pried off the last Horizon logo, a silver bird that once screamed flight's dream, now hitting the dirt with a dry clank, a late goodbye to a dead empire. Wind whipped the streets, carrying winter's last chill but a hint of new warmth, a promise of change Raven felt in every breath. She gripped a hot coffee, its heat seeping into her hands like a tonic. And for the first time in months, a strange peace settled in, not an end, but a launch. Ethan Parker sat across, hands wrapped around his own cup. He wore a gray sweater. Black hair mussed by the breeze, eyes alight with a mix of hype and fatigue. It's done, he said, pride edging his voice. Atlantic's locked in Horizon's assets. Offered jobs to all certified staff except the brass getting grilled. Got my offer this morning. Raven sipped, the bitter warmth sliding easily. Good, she said, voice low but pleased. You deserve it, Ethan. Everyone clean from that shitshow does. Ethan studied her, admiration bare in his gaze. You changed it all, Raven, he said, voice dropping like a secret. Not just for me, for all of us. Horizon didn't fall cause of FAA or the press, it fell cause you stood up. Never seen anyone pull that off. Raven gave a thin smile, eyes on the logo's last pieces glinting in weak sun before getting tossed on a truck. Not me, she said, soft but firm. Jasper Reed, Lena Carter, we did it together. I just flipped the switch. But the fire came from everyone who wouldn't bend. Ethan nodded, but his grin hinted he wasn't buying it. You're too humble, he said. You're the wind that blew that house down. Her phone buzzed, cutting through. Ivy Brooks calling. Raven picked up and Ivy's voice blasted out, hyped and cheeky as ever. You catch the news? DOJ just nailed Garrett and his crew with criminal charges, reckless endangerment. They're done, Raven. Raven laughed softly, a real, easy sound breaking the cafe's hush. Ethan just told me, she said, grin sneaking in. Thanks, Ivy. No way I'd have hit send without you. Don't thank me, Ivy teased, pride ringing through. You held the torch. I just passed the match. Now rest. Sis, you've earned it. Call over. Raven pocketed her phone, eyes back on the street. Horizon's building was a hollow shell, bare walls, dark windows. A heavy silence where power and corruption once ruled. Emotions swirled, satisfaction at justice, pride in standing firm, a twinge of emptiness from the grind. Horizon crashed not from the sky with a busted roar, but from its own rot. And Raven, steel wings intact, stood in the wreckage, not a cocky victor, but a survivor carrying light. Months later, at Atlantic Airways' new digs, Raven walked into the crew lounge with a different feel, light, free, like a weight she hadn't named had lifted. She wore Atlantic's uniform, her gold stripes still shining like war wounds, but now they meant rebirth. The lounge buzzed, friendly pilots and attendants chatting loudly, laughter mixing with fresh coffee scent. No more side eyes, no whispers. She was part of the crew, not an outsider. She was checking her flight roster on her iPad when a young voice piped up. Captain Steele? Raven turned to see Sasha Evans. A fresh-faced black pilot just bumped to first officer. Sasha's curly hair was tied high, brown eyes blazing confidence. A wide grin Raven knew from her own rookie days. She rocked her Atlantic uniform with pride, a young warrior ready to own the sky. "First Officer Evans," Raven said, nodding with a rare smile. "Congrats on the promotion." Sasha stepped closer, voice thick with feeling. "I just want to say, what you did at Horizon's why I didn't quit," she said, eyes shining true. "Starting out, they told me the sky wasn't for girls like me, a black kid from the projects. Then I heard about you, how you took on a whole system and won. That gave me the guts to keep going." Raven looked at her, warmth flooding her chest. She rested a hand on Sasha's shoulder, voice low but strong. "The sky's ours, First Officer Evans," she said. "Never forget that. You don't need permission to fly, just your own wings." Sasha nodded, eyes sparking with fresh resolve. "Thank you," she said quietly, then turned, her steps ringing confidently on the floor. Raven watched her go, a quiet pride swelling. She hadn't just fought for herself, she'd cleared a path for Sasha, for anyone who'd fly higher, farther, free of the chains she'd shattered. Raven's first Atlantic flight took off on a clear afternoon, the sky stretching wide with endless white clouds. She sat in the Airbus A320's cockpit, Ethan at her side as co-pilot. And when the plane lifted, engines roaring like a freedom song, she saw Chicago's skyline fade through the windshield, giving way to the vastness she called home. Every takeoff reminded her why she picked this life. Not fame, not cash, but the unmatched rush of melting into the sky. At cruising altitude, she replayed those first words. "Captain Steele, we need you to wait out there." They'd stung like a blade once, but now they were the spark that drove her to torch Horizon's dark web. Their fall wasn't just her win, it rippled through aviation. Atlantic rolled out blind hiring, whistleblower protections, an independent safety board, shifts Raven knew wouldn't have happened without her stand. The industry was inching forward, slow but sure. Thanks to her, Jasper, Lena, Ethan, folks who put truth and safety first. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text. She checked it quickly on autopilot from Victor Grayson, her old check captain at Horizon. "I'm sorry for my part in it," it read, short but loaded. Raven stared, mixed feelings churning. Victor wasn't the mastermind, but he'd stayed mute when she needed backup. She tapped back. "Apology accepted, Captain Grayson. The sky's for all of us." Hitting send, a calm spread, not from forgiving him, but from outgrowing him. Outgrowing it all. Ethan glanced over, curious. "You good, Captain?" Raven nodded, eyes on the endless sky ahead. "Better than good," she said, voice low but alive. "I'm flying in this time. No one's holding me back." The plane pressed on, slicing clouds like a free bird. Raven felt the engine's pulse, her own breath, and a fierce belief she'd found her place. Horizon was ash, but from it a new dawn blazed, not just for her, but for every dreamer bold enough to claim the sky. She smiled, a grin no one saw, and in her core, her steel wings spread wider than ever, ready to fly far, fly high, and never look back.